بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا، واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the chapter of Al-Hadid, chapter 57, verse 23. Allah says, لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسَوْا عَلَى مَا فَاتَكُمْ وَلَا تَفْرَحُوا بِمَا آتَاكُمْ وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ كُلَّ مُخْتَالٍ فَخُورٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this verse, He says, so that you may not grieve for what has escaped you, nor be happy for what is to come. And Allah does not love those who are arrogant boasters. Sadaqallahu al-Aliyyul Azim. Amanna billah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today, the title of our lecture is Free at Last. And the topic of freedom is truly one that touches all of our lives, though many of us don't recognize what it took for us to become as free as we are today, even though we are locked up pretty much in social distancing and self-isolation. It has helped us to actually recognize and understand what it is that we have taken for granted when it comes to freedom. However, the topic of freedom itself is one that requires us to really delve into in order for us to understand, so that we can appreciate what it is that we have. For surely if we were to appreciate what we have, then we wouldn't take it for granted ever again. In order first and foremost to take a look at the topic of freedom, as usual, what we will do is look at it from three perspectives: from a logical perspective, from an academic perspective, and then we'll look at it from an Islamic perspective. Now, in the logical perspective, we know that if we start at the reference point in which we prove that the creator of something is not limited by his creation, and therefore the creator of all of limitation must be unlimited, I realize that my creator is unlimited and therefore is all perfect, and therefore he is all purposeful and all wise and all just and all knowing. And once I realize that my greatest purpose truly in life is to show him gratitude, right? To show him that I appreciate him for the life that he's giving me, for choosing me for existence, for surely the most perfect choosing me to exist gives me great worth and gives every other creation great worth and value. If nothing else, that as a purpose is surely sufficient. But I realize that being thankful to him and showing him gratitude is probably the greatest act of freedom that he has afforded me. And I say he has afforded me because of the fact that I know that he gave me choice to choose him. For surely it would be ugly for him and cruel for him to compel me, and through compulsion to have me live this life forced to follow him, forced to appreciate him, and forced to be in a specific way. And surely that would be without cause, without purpose, right? And therefore, since we know that the creator is neither oppressive nor does he do things without purpose, then we know the necessity of him giving us the choice to be able to choose him. And that with that, we would be able to realize our purpose by ourselves using our own intellectual reasoning. And surely there is no greater blessing than that. And that there is no greater freedom than the freedom of choice. And so as a result, we understand that logically, we are all therefore born free, free to think, free to come to the conclusion that our creator exists. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our creator, gives us the opportunity over our lifespan to discover him. And once we discover him, to choose whether we should appreciate him or not. And so the greatest freedom that we could ever have is the freedom of our intellectual thinking. And through the freedom of our intellectual thinking, we're able to make the right choices, the choices that we want for ourselves. Once we understand this, it's a very simple argument. We come to realize that truly the only way to be free is to be free to think first and foremost, And the only way to be free, secondly, is to have the freedom to choose. So let's move on to the academic understanding of freedom. Now, if we look at the term freedom itself and we look it up in the dictionary, what we'll find that there are two meanings that are given. The first is called the power, or the first meaning is the power or right to act, speak, or think as you want. The second is the state of not being prisoned or enslaved. Now, since the topic of enslavement and imprisonment has come along, it's important for us to take a look at this whole idea of imprisonment and slavery. And the reason why I want to mention this is because as far back as the time of Buddha, when the caste system was established by the Brahmins, even before the time of Buddha. Buddha existed, they say, from 563 BC to 483 BC. And in that time, they had a system called Brahmanism. It's the religion that they followed. And this religion dictated that those who were from the head of Brahma were considered the nobility and the scholars. Those from the chest of Brahma were considered the warriors. Those from the thorax of Brahma were considered the tradesmen and merchants. Those from the legs of Brahma were considered to be the servants. And those outside of the body of Brahma were considered to be the lowliest of creations, the slaves and the servants and the maids, right? And these individuals specifically were considered to be impure. So anybody who wasn't from the body of Brahma was considered to be impure. And this would be an inherited state from one generation to the other. So one cannot escape the level that they're born into. As a result, the population succumbs to the idea of a lack of freedom if you're not from the higher levels of the body of Brahma. Buddha himself, he rejected this concept. He rejected the caste system. He believed that all humanity are created equal. And by rejecting this system and moving himself outside of that system, keeping in mind that he was of the nobility, he made the active, intellectual, rational choice for freedom for all. And as a result, to this day, he has a great following. Now, some would say that Brahma was the reason for the enchainment and the imprisonment of everyone into a caste system. But that Buddha himself, because of his righteous actions, probably was considered to be a prophet of his times. And that is why his teachings have had such an outlasting effect. Now, I wanted to delve a little into the idea of slavery, right? Because there's no greater way to understand freedom than to look at slavery itself. And looking at slavery from the human timeline, we find, for example, that it wasn't until 1811 that Spain abolished slavery. We found also that in 1813, Sweden banned slave trading. In 1814, the Netherlands banned slave trading. 1817, France banned slave trading, but it wasn't effective until 1826. And in 1833, Britain passes the Abolition of Slavery Act, ordering the gradual abolition of slavery in the British colonies, in which plantation owners in the West Indies received 20 million pounds in compensation for having to release their slaves. Now, in 1865, in the United States, the US Congress, in January 31st of 1865, passed a law called the 13th Amendment, and it abolished slavery in the United States. So now, this is slavery as a base understanding of how one can be physically enchained into labor, right? But we do know that there's another kind of slavery, right? There's the slavery of the minds. And this usually occurs as a result of racial segregation. Now, this prejudice is a direct result of the fact that people have been pre-programmed and now have behavioral patterns in which slavery has been accepted for years upon years. Now, the fact that slavery was accepted for so long means that in the human mind, for most of the population, their way of thinking had to do with whether they were enchained, these individuals, or not. They still looked at them the same way. They still looked at that person as being lesser than them, because a slave was part of that caste system as a result, and he was at the lower end of it. So the prejudices still remained, which means that the humans were still enchained, though not physically, emotionally, and mentally. We find, for example, after the abolition of slavery or the abolishment of slavery in the United States in 1865, remember that in 1865, what happened? The 13th Amendment was passed, right? But also in the same year, in 1865, there were laws named Black laws that were actually implemented, also known as Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow was actually a derogatory term that was used for Blacks. Now, the legislators, what they did was they passed these laws to segregate whites from Blacks in residential areas, in schools, in parks, in theaters, even in cemeteries and asylums and jails and residential homes. So in actual fact, though in 1965, there was a transition from physical slavery, right? There was, unfortunately, the legislation of another type of slavery, a slavery of segregation, as opposed to a slavery of imprisonment. The problem was that there was still a lack of freedom, right? Now, what we find was that in India, for example, in 1930, a man by the name of Gandhi sought to liberate his country from also another type of slavery, the slavery of the nations, colonization, right? Because India was basically enslaved or colonized by Britain. And Gandhi, who was a lawyer, sought to liberate his country, to make it independent of the slavery of colonization, right? So what ended up happening was that in 1947, Gandhi was able to achieve his goal, and independence was granted to India in 1947. So notice that India actually established independence from its colony, Britain, in 1947, while we find that slavery was abolished in the United States when, in 1865, though there still was segregation. What we also find is that if we move forward again, if we look, move forward into US history, when was it that segregation really was truly challenged in the United States? Though it was challenged for many years before 1955, the reality was that it wasn't until 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, as a result of Rosa Parks, who became the initiator or became known as the mother of the human rights movement, the civil rights movement in the United States, that truly the movement towards the abolishment of segregation became a reality in the United States of America. This was in 1955, keep in mind. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sought to raise the public consciousness about racism. Now today, there are many that still contend that even though there was an abolishment, let's say, of the segregation officially in the United States at that time, the reality is that schools remained segregated up until 1968. Just the other day, I saw a report that there was even in the South still schools that still had the sign that it was for white students only, as opposed to Black students. And you can find such reports on YouTube very simply by local or international news media outlets. So a person as simple and as humble as Rosa Parks, who was a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, all she did was she did one thing. She refused to give up her seat. And her seat wasn't actually her designated seat. Instead of sitting in the back of the bus, she chose to sit in the front of the bus. and challenge a woman and challenge the bus driver who would tell her to get out of her seat and move to the back of the bus. But she reclaimed her freedom from segregation. How? By making the intellectual choice not to conform to bad legislation. Now, we find also that if we look into the annals of American history, we find that women themselves, so remember, what year was this? This is segregation in 1965 or 68, I should say, was abolished, right? The movement was in 1955. But remember, India was 1947, right? The black segregation laws were in 1865. So if we look at the black segregation laws in 1865, we find that women themselves, were not considered to be human in US history until the 19th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment didn't actually take effect until 1919 to 1920. 1919, women in the United States were considered not to be cattle anymore. They were considered to be human beings. Can you imagine that in the United States of America, the land of freedom and liberation, that women did not and were not recognized as being human until 1919, and were not allowed to vote until 1920. So what about the women's rights movements? We know that the women's rights movements were between 1960 and 1970. So in order for a woman to really regain her rights and become in the view of the public as being equal, women had to fight from 1919, and before that, of course, up until the 1960s and 70s. And even today, what we find is all of these arguments about gender inequality, right? About women getting lower pay, even though they have high positions as CEOs of companies or as directors. What we also find is that in Africa, so far we've looked at the United States, we've looked at different countries and when they abolished slavery, but I also want to look at South Africa, which is the most known for slavery, right? For apartheid and segregation. And they themselves were not able to release themselves and their population from the chains of apartheid until 27 years after Nelson Mandela was imprisoned in 1962. So 27 years after 1962, imagine that. When he was released, he was then to become president of South Africa. What choice did he make? He chose intellectually and mentally, just like Gandhi, to refuse colonization, to refuse segregation, to refuse mental and social imprisonment, not just legislatively, but intellectually. And once that rejection occurred, it became a lot easier for the change to occur. Nonconformity in this case became reform. The whole idea was to reform for each one of these events and each one of these individuals that had such profound human movements, human rights movements, in order for them to change society as we know it today. Now, if we look at Islam and we take a very close look at what it was that Islam was able to do. Now, we know for a fact that Islam was introduced 1400 years ago to humanity, right? And that humanity themselves, in that time, in that era, women were not considered to be human. We know that even as far as the time of, as we mentioned, the time of Buddha, and even before that, we know for a fact that whether it was in Rome or in Persia or anywhere else, women were treated as cattle prod. The same thing was the case in the Arabian Peninsula. However, what we find is that when Islam was introduced to the area with the revelation of the Holy Quran, that women were given their rights to an education, their rights to marriage, their rights to not just marriage, to actually choose their husband. Imam Ali salamullah alayh is known to have said, Jihadul mar'ati husnul taba'ul, that the struggle of a woman is to choose a righteous husband, right? And to choose well. We find that the marriage formula, the contract itself, is initiated by the woman herself, which implies that she is not compelled to marry anyone. Even though there may be cultural and social pressures, it is at the end of the road her choice who she marries. We find that in a time where women were, where prostitution was rampant, slavery was rampant, Islam came along and it abolished prostitution. It prohibited it. And it worked very hard to abolish slavery. But slavery was so much entrenched within society that Islam made it the penance to release a slave. The imams, as well as the Prophet, they would buy slaves and then they would teach them Islam and then they would liberate them. So Islam became a huge human rights advocate. Its goal was to really create a system, a holistic system of rights, as we see in the treaties of rights by the Imam Sajjad, to give everybody their right. And one of the most important due rights that the Quran gave is that every human being is born ala al-fitra, meaning that every human being is born free. But what is freedom really in Islam? This is one of the things that we need to understand. We started out with an important verse, and that verse is in the chapter of Al-Hadid, chapter 57. We recited verse 23. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beautifully says in the verse before it, verse 22, he says, Ma asaba min musibatin fil ardi, that there isn't a calamity that one faces on this earth, wala fi anfusikum, whether the calamity and tragedy is around you or whether it's within yourselves, it occurs to you, illa fi kitabin min qabl, except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written it in a book before. أَن نَبْرَأَهَا إِنَّ ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ يَسِيرٌ. He says, before we bring it into existence, surely that is easy for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, in the verse that we started out with, verse 23 of the same chapter, Allah explains why He inflicts us with these calamities and why He writes them for us. Allah says, لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسَوْا عَلَى مَا فَاتَكُمْ, so that you may not grieve, you may not feel bad for those opportunities that you missed, right? That escaped you. He says, وَلَا تَفْرَحُوا بِمَا آتَاكُمْ, and so that you aren't happy or exultant for what will come. And Allah then says, وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ كُلَّ مُخْتَالٍ فَخُورٍ. Surely Allah does not love or like any person who is an arrogant boaster. So what we find here then is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the philosophy behind any calamity that we face. And that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places us in a position that we realize that the past has gone and that the present is the only thing that remains and the future may never come. That's what a calamity does. It makes us realize that we've taken our lives for granted. And in that is true freedom, according to Amir al-Mu'mineen salamullahi alayhi. Now, how is freedom defined in Islam? Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq salamullahi alayhi says, خمس خصال لم تكن فيه خصلة منها من لم تكن فيه خصلة منها فليس فيه كثير مستمتع. He says, look, there are 5 characteristics who, if someone doesn't have, then they're not going to live a fruitful life. He says the first is al-wafa, the first is loyalty. The second is al-tadbir, the ability to work through things and to think about things and to intellectualize and rationalize. The third, he says al-haya, he says a sense of shyness. The fourth, he says husnul khuluq, to have good manners. And the fifth, he says وَهِيَ تَجْمَعُ هَذِهِ الْخِصَالِ, he says, and it combines all of these characteristics. He says al-hurriya, freedom. He says freedom is all of these things, okay? Al-Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi, he says it beautifully, because many of us, especially those who contend that someone can be born into slavery or born into a level of the caste system. What does Islam say about this? Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi says, Ya ayyuhan nas, or ayyuhan nas, inna Adama lam yalid abdan wala amatan. He says, Prophet Adam did not give birth, him and his wife, to a slave, whether male or female. وَإِنَّ النَّاسَ كُلُّهُمْ أَحْرَارٌ, and that all people are free. So the question is then, if we're all born free, then what is it that breaks that freedom? Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi, he says it beautifully. He says, لا تكن عبد غيرك وقد جعلك الله حرا. He says, listen, we are enslaved to others. Don't accept the slavery to others, he says. That mental and intellectual acceptance in the aql makes you enslaved to others. So don't be enslaved by others when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you free, he says. So then, and the most important thing where someone can be enslaved, even if there's no legislation for slavery, right? We don't exist in a time today where slavery is legislated anywhere. However, we can be enslaved by our intellects. We can be enslaved by how we think. We can be enslaved by whomever we choose to take us as prisoner or to enslave us and victimize us, right? So once we release ourselves mentally from those chains, then we're able to be free in thought, right? Free in choice. You've heard many people say, why did you do this? They say, well, I didn't have a choice, right? This person was forcing me to do it. In reality, you do have a choice, right? At the end of the road, if you enslave yourself to that person and the pressure that they're placing on you, just like when you have peer pressure in school and you say, well, I was forced. Or let's say, for example, you're forced to go to medical school. At the end of the road, you're not forced by your peers. You're not forced by your parents. The choice is really yours. But you have a mental state of enslavement, right? And that can occur simply by either us fearing lack of acceptance, right? Or us fearing that that person who has a higher status than us might be disappointed and we hold them to high regard. Another thing that enslaves us, Imam Ali says, is greed. He says, وَلَا يَسْتَرِقَنَّكَ وَقَدْ جَعَلَكَ اللَّهُ حُرًّا. And don't let greed be the reason for your enchainment, your imprisonment and slavery, for Allah has created you free. So how do I know that I'm free, really? How do I know? Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi, he says it beautifully. He says, look, إِنَّ الْحَيَاءَ, if you have shyness, وَالْعِفَّةَ من خلائق الإيمان. He says, look, if you have shyness and if you have chastity, that those are the manners of one who has iman, who has belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because we would be too shy to do something that may offend Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we would be chaste. Why? We would have chastity as one of our attributes, because again, we are too embarrassed to offend Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and fall into his prohibitions. And then he says, وَإِنَّهُمَا لَسَجِيَّةُ الْأَحْرَارِ وَشِيمَةُ الْأَبْرَارِ. He says, surely having a sense of shyness, so not putting ourselves out there. Today, living in a world of social media, many of us, even those who consider themselves to be shy, put themselves on Snapchat or on TikTok, unfortunately, or on Instagram, right? And they hide what they do from their parents. And they even things such as simple as getting on Instagram and talking about things, reciting, music or poetry, putting yourself out there for others to see, right? That really contradicts shyness. So we have to be aware of that. And chastity, of course, making sure that we don't expose ourselves to compromising situations. The question is then, how do I become free? How do I become free from, the greed? How do I become free from the expectations? Imam Ali salamullah alayhi, he says it beautifully. He says, "Man taraka shahawat kana hurran." He says, look, your goal is to have iman, right? He says, if you want to have that state of iman, you have to leave your carnal desires, your desires, those desires that push you away from Allah. These are shahawat. He says, if you do so, then you're considered to be free. So freedom then is freedom from shahawat, from worldly wants and needs. Another word for this is called az-zuhd, asceticism. When you don't want anything that is materialistic in this world, anything that is carnal in desire, anything, when you're not imprisoned to social media, when you're not imprisoned to the Gucci bag and the Louis Vuitton and the Bugatti and the celebrity life, right? And the blinged out culture, that's when truly you are considered free of the confines of materialism. And when you are free of the confines of materialism, you are liberated. Why? Because you are free to be in the realm of transcendence, of being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning being how Allah wants you to be, not how society wants you to be. Because we know society, as we mentioned before, has specific laws that are based on what? And of course, cultures that are based on human opinion, not necessarily on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. So if I reject those things, and if I follow what Allah wants of me, by making the rational, logical choice to do so, then surely I have freed myself from the enchainment of society, and I have become now free to transcend and elevate towards the highest levels and status that Allah wants of me, because I have no longer connected myself to the world of limitation. I've connected myself to my unlimited creator, and there is no greater freedom than to do that. So then that means that I have to let go of all of my greed and all of my wants. I have to have contentment in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells me. And that's what Amir al-Mu'mineen says. He says, Al-abdul hurru ma qani'. He says, a person who is considered free is a person who is content with what Allah has given them. That doesn't mean don't work hard for what you have. No, work hard, but it shouldn't keep you away from Allah. You shouldn't be imprisoned and enchained and held down by your materialistic wants and gains, right? That today, if you were to lose all of the material possessions that you have, you'd still be that same person. You'd still have the same allegiance to Allah. You'd still spend the same time worshiping Allah. That it didn't affect you. You gave Allah His due right, right? We find that if we give everything its due right, then at the end of the road, as we mentioned in the lecture on time and time management, tell me how you spend your time, I'll tell you who you are. Then if I'm giving Allah His due right, and I'm giving His worshippers their due right by showing that I appreciate them and their worth, because surely they are worthy to Allah because He created them, then it should be that I'm content with what I have, right? And if I am, then I'm going to be free from the chains of materialism, and I won't feel a sense of greed. And that's why the Imam says, Al-hurru abdun ma tama. He says a person is free until he feels greed. He feels that materialistic want. So that means then, what is this contentment? This contentment really is a state of zuhd, of saying, I am happy with what Allah has given me. And my goal in life is not to work only on materialistic gains. This is only so that I can live comfortably and give to others in charity. But the main and most important motivation that I have to be a great human being is that I want to show my appreciation to Allah, that I have a belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that this sense of asceticism then comes from that state of iman that I have. Imam Ali also says beautifully about zuhd, asceticism. He says, Man zahida fi dunya ahtaqa nafsah wa arda rabbah. A person who becomes ascetic is not controlled by materialistic wealth and gains. He says he has liberated himself. So once we liberate ourselves from materialism, what has happened is we have made our Lord pleased with us. And that is our main goal in this life, right? So what does it mean to be ascetic then? We understand it's to release ourselves from materialism. And Imam Ali salamullah alayhi, he says it beautifully. He says, الزهد كله في كلمتين من القرآن. He said, look, zuhd, asceticism, can be summed up in 2 words of the Holy Quran. Remember that chapter of Al-Hadid, chapter 57, verse 23? This is the chapter that and verse that he refers to. He says, قال الله تعالى لكي لا تأسوا على ما فاتكم ولا تفرحوا فيما آتاكم. Right? He says, so that you don't feel bad about what you missed. If you weren't connected emotionally to the materialistic world, to the needs and wants that you had before, when you get to that point when you think, in such a calamity, for example, you say, oh, I should have gone bungee jumping, or I should have, gotten that degree, or I should have done, all of these materialistic and physical things that we seem to think about when we go through a calamity, our bucket list, so to speak. What ends up happening is that when we free ourselves from that thinking, that's when we know we have truly liberated ourselves and we are in a state of zuhd or asceticism. However, if we do think that way, that, oh, I wish I had done this, I wish I had done that, I'm now enchained to my past. And that past is a materialistic past. The only enchainment I should have when I'm thinking about the past is how I didn't worship Allah as much as I should have. I didn't spend that time coming closer to Allah. I wasn't content with what Allah had given me, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in that very verse, he says, and so that you don't feel a sense of joy and happiness for what is to come. Allah says, he's not saying, listen, don't be optimistic for life. Don't be optimistic for the opportunities to come. That's not what he's saying. He says, don't be enchained by thinking that those opportunities are guaranteed for you, right? Because they may not come. What you do have is now. So live in the now and do what you need to do now to come closer to Allah. And first and foremost, release yourselves from such chains. Intellectually, first and foremost. A person who is ascetic, Imam Ali says, لا يفرح, Imam al-Baqir says, لا يفرح بشيء من الدنيا أتى. He doesn't have that sense of joy when he receives something from this world. You know how when you go to a store in the mall and you really want to buy something like a pair of shoes or a bag or something that you really wanted, you know that joy that overcomes you? He says you shouldn't really have that sense of joy because you shouldn't be attached to something materialistic so much that the joy that you get comes from wearing a pair of LeBron's sneakers or a pair of Kobe's, right? Or having that Louis Vuitton bag. Your real joy should be in what? In knowing that you've satisfied Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Your real joy should be what? Should be in knowing that you served humanity and gave wealth to the poor. That should be your joy. The sense of contentment that you have pleased Allah. Not that you bought new clothes or new pants or anything else like that or a new car. He says, وَلَا يَحْزَنْ عَلَى شَيْءٍ مِّن مَا فَاتَهُ. Same thing. And that he is not saddened by an opportunity that was missed. Prophet Muhammad says, look, الزهد في الدنيا قصر الأمل. He says, if you want to have zuhd and asceticism in this world, then you need to do what? You need to get rid of that false hope. Make sure that you don't have false hope that tomorrow will even come. Because if you do, then you're not going to worry about today and what you need to do. He says, وَشُكْرُ كُلِّ نِعْمَةٍ. He says, and for one to be thankful for every blessing that one has. He says, that is true zuhd. True zuhd is not to have false hope, number one, because remember, it makes us forget the hereafter, right? As Imam Ali said. 2, to be thankful for what we have. 3, he says, وَالْوَرَعُ عَنْ كُلِّ مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ. He says, and to be precautious, not to fall into the prohibitions of Allah, to actually avoid them completely. Imam Ali, he reflects exactly what Prophet Muhammad said. He says, الزهد تقصير الآمال وإخلاص الأعمال. He says, look, asceticism is that you reduce your false hope. Right? Number 1. And 2, he says, sincerity in your deeds. Sincerity to whom? Sincerity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone and no other. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to realize the importance of what we have now. To allow us surely to be content with what we have. As Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi says, Al-qana'atu kanzun la yanfad. That when we are content with what Allah has given us and we see the reality of this life, we see that the most important thing to us is yaqeen. For surely it is the pillar upon which our very faith, al-iman, sits, as Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq says. Then and only then will I realize that my power of choice is to choose Allah and what He wants for me alone. And that means to do and to give everything it's right now, before it's too late. And whatever passed has passed and has gone and will never return. But what I can change is now. And with my good deeds now and today, based on my belief, based on my contentment with what I have, surely sufficiency will be what I have. It will be given by my Lord. Why? Because I dedicated every single part of me to Allah Almighty. We find then that 1400 years ago, Islam gave us a comprehensive system for humanity. That what the human lifespan has shown us in human history and human archives of how humans around the world fought for their freedom, that it was only recently in the past 100 years or less that humanity were able to actually free themselves from the chain of slavery, whether it be physical or mental. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala frees us from all prejudice. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala frees us from this world and allows us to enter heaven with Ahlul Bayt alayhim afdal as-salatu was-salam. We ask that Allah makes us free in this dunya and free in the hereafter, like al-Hurr, who truly chose freedom over the enchainment of greed and over the enchainment of worldly possessions. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows His mercy upon our deceased, and that He bestows His and bestows health on our sick. He repays the debts of all those who are in debt. He removes oppression from all those who are oppressed. He returns the estranged to their families, and He frees all those who have been enslaved and enchained and imprisoned unrightfully. We ask in the name of Imam al-Hujjah salamullah alayhi and Ahlul Bayt, every single one of them, that Allah makes us free enough to be in the army of the free, the servants of Imam al-Hujjah, Ajjallah ta'ala farajahu al-Sharif. We ask that Allah hastens His appearance and makes us of His servants. We recite the Surah Al-Fatiha for all those that we mentioned so that Allah responds. For surely He is the one who said, "Id'uni astajib lakum, faha nahnu nad'uka ya Rabbal Alameen." He has told us, ask and I will answer. So here we are asking, and surely He guarantees the answer. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلي يا ربي على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين والفاتحة على أرواح المرحومين مسبوقة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. صلوات.